Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our show, we're pleased to speak with Bill Thomas, proprietor of the Jack Rose Dining Saloon in Washington, D.C., who's turned his passion for fine whiskey into a lifelong pursuit. Bill, welcome to the show.
Great, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Bill, you're quite the expert on whiskeys. We're going to get into all of that as we go forward, but I'd like you to take us back. Take us back to the early days when the frontier was still east of the Mississippi, when farmers used to convert their grains into whiskey for storage and as a form of currency, and we had our first rebellion. Take us back and tell us about that.
It's a funny thing, the Whiskey Rebellion, which comes around due to the fact that a lot of the debts were taken over by the federal government, and one of the ways that debt had to be paid was by taxing the farmers on whiskey. And unfortunately, one of the huge mistakes the federal government made, or maybe an Alexander Hamilton blunder, was asking that this tax be paid in hard currency, which at the time we had a country based primarily on a barter economy.
Right. I mean, it was doubloons that were circling. There was really no good monetary system at the time.
Absolutely. And the booze that we created, and we aren't talking bourbon, we aren't talking rye, we're talking about American whiskey. We're talking about some sort of whiskey or fermented grain that was used as currency. Excess crops that were turned into fermented grain ultimately became some sort of American whiskey and used as the currency or the barter of the times to buy goods and services. And then you have the federal government all of a sudden requiring a hard currency tax, and that's just something that the farmers or the producers of this product, this whiskey, didn't have. And the funny thing is, you have the Whiskey Rebellion taking place, most commonly known in Pennsylvania. What you don't hear about is also the one that was taking place simultaneously in the Kentucky region as well.
I don't know about that one. Tell us about it.
Well, what you had is the whiskey tax being placed on everyone in the United States. What you had, though, was the ability to try and enforce it in Pennsylvania. You had Washington being able to raise...
Close enough to march troops out.
Exactly, and he marched an army larger than any army that he had ever commanded during the Revolution.
It was a show of force, that's for sure.
Absolutely. They didn't want this to go to an armed conflict.
Right.
They wanted it to show of force to be able to put people in line, which it did. The rebellion was ultimately squashed even prior. Just knowing that Washington was coming with his troops made the farmers say, you know what, let's disperse. They ultimately only convicted 2 people.
Really?
Yeah, during the Revolution. One was called an imbecile and one was called an idiot. And what the difference is, we don't know, but that's how they were listed in the court papers.
They took the rap.
They took the rap. 2 people. The whole Whiskey Rebellion. In Kentucky, what they did was ultimately send someone out there to negotiate it through the court system because they couldn't send a standing army. And what happened was those court cases weren't settled for 20 years, I believe, or so, until hard currency was actually available. In favor. So it was funny. One way they did it with force, one way they just manipulated the court system to their advantage. So they ultimately got something, they saved face, but both rebellions were ultimately squashed in the end.
And what began then was a long tradition of American moonshining.
Well, you have a lot of commercial distillers popping up after this time because they were creating the economies of scale to be successful at distilling. But you still then had the people that operated on the margins and still operate on the margins today creating whiskey.
Pretty raw product.
Yeah. And the funny thing is people think moonshine, ooh, this is a bad product. But I get the opportunity to taste moonshine all the time when I'm visiting Kentucky. And the moonshine that they actually create today is a drinkable product. It's a good product because it is meant for immediate consumption. They don't make bad stuff. They make quality stuff. They just avert the taxes.
But there's a long way between that and the $2,000 bottles of vintage Scotch you have on your shelves.
Absolutely. You don't have the aging. You just have a new make quality.
Well, let's get to that by way of the Prohibition. So the industry grew. Trade, of course, with Scotland brought in good Scotches from there. And we had a little bit of an interruption when the 18th Amendment was passed. What happened to the industry then?
The industry as a whole collapsed. I mean, you had very few commercial distillers were allowed to continue producing during Prohibition. And obviously they were commercial distillers that were allowed to do the for medicinal use only. So you could still go to your drugstore and I think you get a pint every few days was a prescription that you could get from a doctor.
Every few days?
Yes. So you still had a need on the medicinal side and you still had active distilleries producing whiskey.
Sounds like medical marijuana.
Exactly. I mean, it's funny how crazy these industries parallel themselves today. You have something that was illegal that now is kind of on its first cusp of that part of Prohibition where it was legal by prescription, and who knows what the medicinal marijuana is going to go into in the next 5 years. Will it be almost like the repeal of the 18th Amendment?
Might be. Of course, and a huge crime syndicate was created during Prohibition as well, because people still had a taste for the product.
Not only did they have a taste for the product, but actually consumption of alcohol actually went up during Prohibition. It's like anything else. When you say you can't do something, people want to do it even more.
So, Bill, you're the owner of Jack Rose Dining Saloon in Washington, D.C., quite a famous establishment. Describe it for us.
So Jack Rose, kind of on its founding principles, was something that we wanted to create that could house as many quality whiskeys and different brands of whiskeys and different distilleries that people could come in and try. One of the earliest thoughts of Jack Rose is I only ordered bottles that were under $130 and below. We wanted the most accessible whiskeys as possible and as many of them. We wanted this to be a place that people could come, try whiskeys, commiserate with other people that loved whiskeys, because anybody who loves whiskeys loves to talk about whiskeys.
So you have a big tasting bar along with your collection?
Absolutely. This isn't some place where you just come and stare at this expensive set of bottles on a wall collection. We want these bottles to be drunk. And
opened and used.
Yeah. At the end of every day, they have a section where they put the empty bottles, and that's what I love. The more empty bottles, the better. I
have a small single malt collection in my office. It's like a dozen bottles. And every time I get to the end of one, which actually takes a while, I don't drink that much of it, it's a celebration because I get to go buy another one.
Absolutely. And trying whiskeys, especially with the current market in the U.S. where there's so many great distilleries opening up on a daily basis, plus the big guys are offering more special either cash drink selections or altering the mash bill in some way. It's the best time to be drinking whiskey ever in the history of whiskey production.
All right, some basic facts. A properly sealed bottle of whiskey sitting in a cool place, how long will it last before it loses its quality?
We don't know the answer to that simply because we are still opening bottles that have been around 100, 120 years, and they're showing great. It really comes down to whether the actual bottle was sealed properly at the beginning. It was done by a producer who knew what they were doing. And then it is the fact that if it was stored right in something that's out of sunlight in a fairly cool climate. If you do that, I've opened bottles at least 110 years old, and they've showed perfectly.
And tell us about bottles once they're opened. How long do you have to finish drinking it before it starts to turn?
That is a good question. I've had bottles that have opened literally for a day or so, and I've seen a noticeable... Now we're talking about older bottles. We're talking about bottles that are... Let's start with bottles that are 100 years old. I've had bottles that have opened that after about a week or even less, I'm starting to see significant decline or decrease in their quality. I've had other bottles that I've opened and I've let them sit open for nearly a year, and they've showed well a year later. Now, a lot of factors here are how good was the bottle stored at the beginning, and also what level did you drink it to? Obviously, the more oxygen you introduce into the bottle, the greater chance that the bottle is going to decrease in terms of quality a lot faster. Well,
probably some of the most famous bottles, old bottles, have been discovered are the Shackleton bottles. Tell us about that.
Well, the Shackleton bottles, which were part of Shackleton's expedition to Antarctica, it was at his base camp where he actually buried those whiskeys under his base camp.
In the ice.
In the ice. And then he had to, obviously we know that he couldn't move a ship. He had to walk out, him and his crew.
2 years it took.
Yeah, and then what they did was those bottles were discovered at that base camp probably, I think it was about 5 years ago. And what Richard Patterson did for White and McKay, which is Dalmore, is the most famous part of White McKay, I'd say. He went and he repatriated some of those bottles, not all of them, because of Antarctic
regulations.
Regulation. He took them back to White and McKay, and he broke those down to find out what the grain was that was used, where it was from, the kind of Isla barley. And what he did was he combined whiskeys of today to recreate a flavor profile that's similar, as similar as he could, to the Shackleton bottles. And that's what you have on the market today. It's actually a recreation of those, not the actual bottle.
No, of course. I have a bottle of it. It's actually pretty good.
Yeah, it was. We did the launch party here at Jack Rose for it, and it was very well received.
Bill, for our neophyte listeners, break us down the difference between Scotch, bourbon, and rye.
Well, the biggest difference between Scotch, bourbon, and rye, and I'll try and take them in that order, is the fact that Scotch is one of two things commonly known. It's single malt Scotch, obviously made from just malted barley, and then you have blended Scotch, which is made from taking single malts and mingling them with single grain whiskeys.
Like a Johnny Walker.
Exactly, like a Johnny Walker. And blended still accounts for the predominance of Scotch sales. But single malts, especially since the 90s, are a growing industry. And that's really kind of a passion for whiskey people, is those single malts. And seeing what makes each single malt from each distillery different is the malted barley, how they're aging it.
The peat.
If they're doing it, if it's an Islay Scotch, obviously they're known for their heavily peated Scotch, Bruichladdich, Laphroaig, Ardbeg. If it's a Speyside or a Highland or Campbellton, they could be doing a mixture of peat and non-peat. They could be smoking their barley or not and just having some of that flavored peat that runs through the peat bogs that ultimately gets used in distillation. Now, with bourbon, you have some very strict tenets with bourbon. It's got to be made from at least 51% corn. The secondary grain is generally malted barley, just like in Scotch. And the third grain is generally rye or wheat. But sometimes they use oats, they use rice. Any grain can be used. Some people think it's just corn, malted barley, and rye or wheat, but that's not the case. It could be any other grain. It just has to be at least 51% corn. For rye, those same tenets exist, except for you flip it, and it's got to be at least 51% rye.
So, Bill, when I drink my blends, I usually put it on the rocks, and in fact, I'll drink it about a third of the way down, put some more water in, drink it a third of the way down again, kind of nurse it for a while. But when I drink my single malts, it's always neat. Is that correct, or am I doing it wrong?
First of all, here at Jack Rose, we always say there's no wrong way to drink whiskey, just drink whiskey. Sometimes you're in the mood for whiskey a particular way. You know, what we try to tell our guests here is we'd like you to try a single malt or a bourbon or an Irish or any of the whiskeys. Try them neat first. Then we often tell them to add incremental drops of water. So we'll give you a little eyedropper next to your glass.
Does that really make a difference, one drop?
It does. It makes a huge difference.
Why? What's the chemistry behind that?
So what you do is the drop of water will, one, separate the oils in the whiskey and open up the aromas.
Oils?
So you get this bigger nose feel or smell. And then, obviously, a drop of water in either a half ounce, ounce, or 2 ounces of water, depending upon what size of dram you're having, can make a big difference in dropping that alcohol content. So we always say that we love cash strength whiskeys because adults can water their own whiskey, you know? But let's face it, every once in a while you're just looking for a blended Scotch on the rocks. It's a nice hot day, especially in the summer, you know? You could have that, or a bourbon on the rocks. I mean, there is no wrong way to drink whiskey. We just ask that, you know, you enjoy the whiskey the way that you like it.
Yeah, well, the only wrong way is to drink too much of it.
If you have a designated driver,
even that's okay. Talk to us about aging barrels.
Let's approach it from each of the different, because everybody has a little different philosophy.
Okay.
In Scotland, they use a lot of used cooperage, mostly bourbon, which they put it in after these barrels get broken down, sent to Scotland, and then they age their single malts in them. Now, what they also do is they may age them in Oloroso sherry casks, PX brandy casks, some sort of wine cask, Chateau Lafite wine casks, and that adds another level of complexity to single malts. So what you have in Scotland is a lot of used cooperage to age their whiskeys in.
Now, was that done as an economy measure? We know a lot about the Scots. They love economy. Or was that done as a flavor measure?
I think it was done both. I don't think one is mutually exclusive. I think that different distilleries decided to do different finishes just on their own, or they decided to use bourbon cooperage because it was accessible. Because in the United States, to make a bourbon, something that's classified in the bourbon category, you can only use newly charred oak barrels. Once they're used once, they have to go somewhere. And I don't think the Scots were short on saying, here's an opportunity to buy some
cheap
used barrels cheap. Yeah. But I think they did it out of a quality. I don't think Scotland's ever done or made a decision that wasn't based on producing or showing the whiskey at its best.
So I understand you have something like 1,800 bottles of the Jack Rose Dining Saloon and even more at home. What's the most expensive bottle you own?
That's a good question. It's funny because the most expensive bottle that I own is probably in the $5,000 or $6,000 range for a single bottle, but that's not necessarily the bottle that I find the most precious. It's funny, there's bottles that I hold in high regard because I found them myself on a liquor store shelf after they'd sat there for 20 years. Those are near and dear to my heart. It's like going to any antiques mall or flea market and finding that great treasure that, you know, it could be worth $30, but you found it in yours.
What do you call those, Dusties?
You call those Dusties, yeah. And then it's funny because people will We'll refer to them as kills. And finding bottles at liquor stores, you're finding them in the wild.
Well, that's the sport part of the business, I suppose.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. It's got its own lingo for hunting whiskey.
What's the best economy Scotch?
Wow, that's a good question. Best economy Scotch.
I have my favorite, but you go first.
Go ahead and tell me your favorite, and I'll see if I want to criticize you.
I'm a Dewar's White Label blend guy, for
Dewar's,
economy Scotch.
Obviously, one of the great blends that's been around forever. Michael Jackson, the famous writer, had a desert island dram of Johnny Walker Black.
Mm-hmm. Something
you could drink every day. For me, on the single malt side, because that's where I would lean to, I love a great Mortlock, Springbank. Some of the ones that I look forward to coming out every year that are fairly inexpensive are the Springbank 12 cash strength, the Lafroig 10 cash strength, and the Lagavulin 12.
Yeah, I find the peaty so hard to drink.
Right. It's funny, if you have a taste for that, and if I walk up to your table, my first question is, what do you drink on a regular basis? We want to tailor your experience to something we know you're going to love.
Yeah, I think Oban was the one I go to most often.
Yeah, Oban. It's a great whiskey. In fact, I think it's their 21-year-old is absolutely amazing.
Yeah. So for a beginning Scotch drinker, someone who's just acquiring a taste for it, obviously doesn't want to get into the real peaty stuff like the Lafroig or the Lagavulin, what would you recommend?
I'd probably start off with a Highland or a Speyside. Mm-hmm. Stay away from the peat. Go with something like a Glenmorangie. Yep. First of all, if you're a wine drinker, it's great. I love it when wine drinkers come in that aren't whiskey drinkers. Mm-hmm. We can find something finished in a great wine cask, something that they're familiar with. And once they know those flavor profiles for the wine, they love drinking the whiskey. It's a great segue in because they're like, wow, I can really see the Sauterne cask here. I can see the Bordeaux cask here. So just that little segue into whiskey drinking, you talk to each person and you find out, how can I hook them in? How can I know I can find a whiskey in this collection that they're going to love. I just need to know where to start.
Let's move on to something that many whiskey drinkers consider sacrilegious, which is mixed drinks. Give us a lowdown on that.
First of all, there's nothing wrong with a great mixed drink. Cocktails have become such a part of any great bar nowadays. It's not some of the 80s where they just created these bad sugary concoctions.
Right.
We are going back to classics, the old-fashioned, the Sazerac, the Manhattan.
Are they really drinking that again? My 90-year-old uncle drinks Manhattans.
Your 90-year-old uncle's a brilliant man, probably. Who doesn't love a great Manhattan? Give me a great whiskey with a touch of sweet vermouth. It's my favorite cocktail, hands down. And some brandy cherries to boot. And here's the thing. This is where people might give me a cash strength whiskey with a little vermouth, because I still want to taste the whiskey in my cocktail. And a great person who's into craft cocktails or classic cocktails knows that a base spirit needs to shine through. You're not trying to hide the flavor. You're trying to give it a different spin. But really what you want ultimately is that flavor to shine through with other ingredients. So I'm a big proponent of cocktails, although I still drink whiskey neat most of the time.
Bill, you've been at this for a while. Have you achieved all your business ambitions?
Absolutely not. There's too many whiskeys out there to...
And that's how you measure it. It's finding the great bottle of whiskey. You didn't measure it in dollars, did you?
At the end of the day, just to give you an idea of who I am, I spend every dime I get back on whiskey. If you look at what I spend on whiskey compared to what I make on whiskey, I probably run at a deficit. It's just acquiring more whiskeys and creating the kind of collection and bunker. And by bunker, I mean there's great whiskeys coming out all the time, and there's great whiskeys that were produced in the past that I want to accumulate as many bottles of only because I want to offer them indefinitely. I want somebody to walk in. Jack Rose 3 years ago when it opened and try whiskey, and I'd love them to be able to walk in 20 years and have that same whiskey again. Mm-hmm. So for me, the business side of it, I think it's settled out of if you find something you're passionate about, something you love, you'll make money at it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I found. I make the money, although I turn it right back into liquid gold.
What a lifestyle business. So I can't guess, looking at your picture, how old you are. You still look relatively young. I hope you're going to be doing this for another 50 years.
We will be. My family got into the bar business in the late 1800s here in Washington, D.C., and I still see one of the locations that they had back then is still up and operational. So when I think about this, I say, wow, there's no reason why restaurants and bars can't make it 100 years, 150 years. So what I've done is I've purchased the building, and my goal ultimately is to have this here 100 years or more. I plan to put it in a trust, and someone who's who's passionate about the concept.
Do you have children? Do you have children who might take over for you?
You know what? My significant other is pushing me to make sure that there's someone to take on this responsibility. But I hope that whether it be someone, a descendant of mine, or someone who currently works for the company, all I want is someone passionate. Put this in a trust and let this company just keep going and offering whiskey for another 100 years.
Bill, that's quite a legacy. Thank you so much for being on the show. That was Bill Thomas, owner of the Jack Rose Dining Saloon, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. If you have any suggestions for topics or guests, please visit realclearradio.org, click on the email Bill link, and drop me a line. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. We'd like to thank Talk Media Network for bringing 105.7 KRMR and 1510 KNNS Kansas to the growing Real Clear Radio Hour family, joining WROM Detroit, 1030 KVOI Tucson, and of course, Bloomberg Boston. That wraps up our show for this week. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.